Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture on Jean-Paul Sartre, Being and Nothingness. Let's get you some notes. Okay, so Jean-Paul Sartre is a French philosopher. That's why I'm really bad pronouncing his name. Any of you have taken French are probably laughing at me right now. That's all right. Sartre, you kind of have to spit a bit when you pronounce French names, and I'm just not really good at that. Americans sometimes just say Sartre or Sartre. That's fine too. I'm not one to judge, whatever you want to say. 20th century philosopher, 1905 to 1980, and a key figure in the development of existentialism, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But remember that I mentioned that Nietzsche was kind of a proto-existentialist, not exactly an existentialist, because that's more of a 20th century thing. But a lot of Nietzsche's ideas, among others, were very influential in the development of existentialism. So you might see some commonalities with Sartre and Nietzsche. Sartre was a very well-known author in his own time. He was a strong supporter of political justice and peace. He lived and worked through World War II, including the German occupation of France, and he contributed to the resistance in various ways, writing political tracts and things like that. So existentialism, he is one of the key figures in the development of a philosophical movement known as existentialism. Existentialism is a modernist movement. So remember, we've divided the history, especially of Western philosophy, which is what we're mostly focusing on, into the ancient, medieval, and modern periods. And then the modern period can be broken down into subdivisions: the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and Modernism, which is a subset of the modern era. It's a little confusing, but the modernism versus modern. And then modernism itself, which we said kind of involved looking at the world in new ways, a bit more relativistic, a bit more experimental. And there were lots of subsets of modernism. So existentialism is kind of a subset of modernism. You could call it a modernist philosophy, broadly speaking. And existentialism in particular was really a radical critique of traditional philosophy. So existentialists like Sartre thought in a lot of ways that philosophy had just been doing things wrong this whole time. The key phrase for existentialists and where they get their name from is this phrase: existence precedes essence. Now, this can get kind of technical. You have to kind of define, what do you mean by existence versus essence philosophically, and why do they think one precedes the other? I don't want to get too far afield in this because it can get really technical. But essence generally is sort of what a thing is, the definition of the thing, the essential qualities that make up a thing. If you're talking about the essence of something, you're usually talking about general definitions that would include lots of examples. Whereas the existence of something is simply that it is a particular existing thing. So if we're talking about, I don't know, unicorns or something, the existence of unicorns is just whether or not there are any actual existing unicorns. The essence of a unicorn would be whatever the kind of general concept, the abstract definition of unicorns would be: magical horses with horns, yada, yada, yada. So you could talk about one without really talking about the other very much. You could talk about the essence, the general definition of what a unicorn is, without necessarily talking about whether or not any particular ones exist. In fact, most people think unicorns don't exist, but they could still talk about a general definition, the essence of them. On the other hand, you could discover the existence of something without really knowing what it is, what its essence is. Scientists, I think, do this all the time when they discover some, new element or something, right? Okay, there's the existence of that element. There it is. But then they have to investigate its essence. What are its general chemical qualities and features, things like that, right? Now, how is that relevant for Sartre in particular? He's applying this to things like humans and human nature. So the essence of humanity would just be whatever your general theory of human nature is. What are human beings? What are the defining characteristics of human beings? Aristotle and Plato thought that the kind of key defining feature of human beings was their rationality, the fact that we were reasoning animals. Marx thought that the key features of human nature were that we were productive and social animals, right? So all the essence of humanity would be your general definition of human beings, your view of what human nature is in general. The existence of human beings is just exactly what it sounds like, the fact that they exist, the particular existence of any one of those particular human beings out there. Look, there's one. Look, there's another one. Right? Now, what's this have to do with existentialism? Existentialism criticized traditional philosophy because, on their view, traditional philosophy tended to prioritize discussions of essence over discussions of existence. And if you look at a lot of our philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, they do seem to do that. They talk about things like human nature in general, the essence of human beings, as though that's somehow philosophically prior to any particular person. And then they turn around and they let that sort of essence, that definition of human beings, actually judge or evaluate particular existing people. So if Aristotle thinks that human nature is essentially rational, then he defines happiness as rational activity of the soul, right, and virtue. But then that means he's going to use that general definition of the essence of humanity to criticize particular human beings. Well, you're a good human being because you're living a rational life. You're a bad human being because you're living an irrational life. Existentialists think that existence precedes essence, that existence is more important and the first thing that we should study, that you don't come up with some abstract essence of humanity and then apply it to individual existing human beings. You should look at individual existing human beings first, and only then maybe talk about essences, if at all. Right? So what does this come down to? Kind of the next line on the slide there. The existentialists such as Sartre reject any so-called objective or universal views of human nature and the good life, and instead focus on specific existing individuals, their individual, lived, subjective, personal experiences, rather than abstract theories. That on their view, essences are all about just coming up with these so-called objective universal views of human nature, as though there's one right answer that fits everyone, and therefore one right answer to the question, what is the good life? And instead say, focus on the existence of each and every particular person, their own very personal, lived, individual experiences. And it's kind of that relativism of modernism more generally we talked about. Now, within existentialism, there are a lot of different sort of sub-existentialisms too, and they had a lot of disagreements amongst themselves about things. Sartre is definitely a representative of atheistic existentialism. Not all existentialists were atheists. There were a number of existentialists who were religious and who think that those general ideas about existentialism can still apply, but not Sartre. So Sartre in particular rejects the existence of any traditional Western notion of God. And by the time he's writing, God is defined in those terms of all those omni prefixes. God is the omni everything. He's omnipotent, omniscient, right? He's all good, all knowing, all powerful. Omni is just a prefix, it means all, right? And so we've talked about this before. It goes back to this idea, Descartes had talked about this a bit, of God as being a perfect being, having all positive qualities to perfection. And that Sartre thinks is an inherently contradictory notion. And we'll see a little bit further below why he thinks that's not right and how that applies to his views of the good life. But just again, to be clear, not all existentialists were atheistic. There are religious existentialists as well. Okay, so Being and Nothingness, 1943. This is arguably Sartre's most important philosophical work. It's certainly his largest philosophical work. It's hundreds of pages, and it lays out kind of all of his major theories. In here, there are a couple of key ideas that play a big role in his thinking about the good life. And these are ideas that come up, and he doesn't really kind of explain them in these passages, which is why I want to talk about them a little bit more. And they're also relevant to our next author, Simone de Beauvoir, who's another existentialist who actually worked with Sartre. So this lets me front load the discussion of de Beauvoir a bit. It'll be a little quicker, easier to get to de Beauvoir's major ideas once we have some of these things in hand. They seem really weird and technical. Some of this is probably a translational issue. Some of this stuff doesn't always translate in a really nice sounding way. It probably reads better in French. But the basic ideas are not actually all that crazy once you get past the terminology. So, he's talking about this idea of being, of existence, because existence precedes essence. He's an existentialist. And Sartre wants to identify at least two major kinds of being. There's what he calls being in itself, and also being for itself. Now, being in itself, another term that he uses for this sometimes is facticity. And this is simply the actuality of anything. This is the fact that it actually exists. There it is. Absolutely everything that exists has being in itself. It is just the basic fact or actuality of its existence. When you say something exists, look, there it is, that table exists. It has being in itself. When you say something doesn't exist, like a unicorn, you're saying it doesn't have being in itself. There's no fact of the thing. It isn't an actual thing. And the thing about being in itself is that it is deterministic. It follows these determinism laws of physics. So everything that exists is operated on by the laws of physics and is therefore determined in a very strict kind of cause and effect way. Determinism, the idea that there is this strict, necessary, inevitable chain of cause and effect that oversees everything, applies to being in itself, because all that stuff is subject to the realm of physics, the laws of physics. However, there is also a different kind of being for itself. And sometimes the fancy word that Sartre uses for that is transcendence. And this is a special kind of being. It is the potential being of something. This is the ability of something to become something else, new or different. And that Sartre strictly limits to human consciousness. Other things just are what they are. And if they change, it's only because they're acted upon by an outside force. So a block of wood is just a block of wood, and it'll never be anything different through its own power. It might become something different if something else acts on it, like the weather or a sculptor. But the wood is just being in itself. It can't change itself. But being for itself is this kind of internal, inherent potential of that thing to change itself into something else, to transcend its own facticity, to transcend its actuality, to have potential to become something more. And according to Sartre, the only things in existence that can do that are fully conscious things, that is, human beings. We are what we are, so we are being in itself too, but we can become more and different than what we are. Human beings also have being for itself. And that is this idea of libertarianism, not a political theory, though there is a political theory called that. This is simply the idea that human beings have a kind of metaphysical liberty, i.e., free will. So everything else is subject to the laws of physics. And we are too. If you jump, you'll fall again. But we also have this conscious ability of free will that transcends the deterministic laws of physics, that allows us to freely recreate ourselves into something new, to have the potential to become something different. Right? So the key thing for this is that human choice and action are fully free, because they're not subject to the laws of physics, because they're just a different kind of being. They are being for itself. So human beings are free, and therefore also fully responsible. The table isn't responsible for its behavior. You can't even really say it has behavior. If I get up in the middle of it and I stub my toe on the table, I can't blame the table. I do for a minute. I usually swear at the table for a second. But that's just me being irrational, right? It couldn't do anything. It had no choice, right? Whereas if a person hits me, I can blame them. That's their fault. They did that through their own free will. So these ideas of freedom and also responsibility are very, very important. And despite the fact that we exist in the physical world that's determined by the laws of physics, we still have free will because we have that consciousness that gives us that being for itself, which transcends our mere physical facticity. Now, an interesting thing to notice is that because we are both being in itself, whatever we actually are at the moment, and being for itself, whatever we can potentially become through our free will, that means there's a kind of constant tension in human beings. And that is, when you exercise your potentiality, you're actually giving up some of your current actuality in order to become some new actuality. And the more you actualize, the less potential you have. Okay? So I talked about in that first day of class, that idea of the midlife crisis. What's going on with that middle-aged guy who has the midlife crisis? This actually is kind of key to thinking about what's going on there. When you're young, you have not very fully actualized. And that's actually pretty cool. You have all this potential. You have all these choices to make. And when you're young, you could make all sorts of choices and potentialize in all sorts of different directions. But the more you make those choices to actualize your potential, it feels at least like, yay, I've become more actualized, but I've given up a lot of potential. So you do that by like getting a degree, getting a job, getting a family, the white picket fence. You've actualized in all these ways. But then the midlife crisis happens because you feel like you have no more potential. Like, oh my God, I'm only 40 and I've already made all the choices I'll ever make. And I have no more potential. And then the midlife crisis is an extreme version of that, where people will sometimes like sabotage their own lives, which seems really weird, all this self-destructive behavior. But according to Sartre, what's going on is they're destroying all that actuality they have because they missed all that potential they have. But the point of having that potential was to actualize, and it's this kind of constant tension. You want to actualize, but you don't want to give up your potential. But you can't be fully actualized and still have all of your potential. Those things are kind of inversely proportional, right? So that's kind of a problem. This actually is at the root of his argument against the existence of God. That Sartre says God is supposed to be a perfect being, but in his terminology, that would mean that God is perfect being in itself and perfect being for itself. That is to say, God would be something fully actualized, right? God is lacking in nothing. But God supposedly also has full potential. There's no limit to God's power to choose or do whatever. But something can't be fully actualized, and perfectly potential at the same time. That's a contradiction. Therefore, there cannot be such a perfect being, i.e., there cannot be a God, according to Sartre. So that's why, he's among the atheist existentialists, but it's also an argument that shows that tension between actualization and potential, and that's something that he kind of gets back to a little bit towards the end of the text. So some key passages with all that stuff in mind. Okay. So in these selections, Sartre wants to start off with this idea of bad faith, right? And this is on page, let's see here, 240. We get a really long editor's introduction. He's trying to help out with the technical terminology, but hopefully I did that too. On 243, he starts talking about this idea of bad faith and falsehood. So what's the idea here? Well, Sartre wants to say that most people live their lives in bad faith. He's not using the word faith in a religious sense here. More like when you say somebody enters into a bad faith agreement with another person, what you mean is they never really had any intention of following it through. That they make bad faith choices and bad faith decisions. And so for Sartre, like, what is it that's at the heart of this? When we talk about bad faith, what's going on? Well, really key to the notion of bad faith is the idea of falsehood. That bad faith, when we describe people's choices and actions as bad faith, what's key to that is that there's some notion of falsehood behind that. And so on 243 and into 244 there, so right at the bottom of 243, going on to the top of 244, very last paragraph on 243, he seems to identify this with the idea of lying to oneself. Frequently, this is identified with falsehood. We say indifferently of a person that he shows sign of bad faith or that he lies to himself, right? And he kind of goes on to talk about this a little bit on 244, that there's something a little weird about the notion of lying to oneself. Because, I mean, when you say that someone is lying, that suggests that they do know what the truth is and they've purposefully decided not to say it, right? I mean, if somebody just doesn't know what the truth is and they say something false, you don't call them a liar, you just call them mistaken or uninformed. But when somebody knows what the truth is but says something false, that's a lie. They've intentionally said something false that they know to be false. So when you think about it, the idea of lying to oneself sounds like a contradiction, right? How could I lie to myself? Because it's only a lie if I know the truth. And if I know the truth, then I wouldn't be able to lie to myself. And yet it turns out, as Sartre points out there, especially kind of the top of 244, we in fact do this, and it's not at all difficult to do this. And this is where 20th century modern psychology is very helpful, right? Here he's probably got Freud in mind, who, despite his problems, still has some interesting insights about human nature and consciousness. So Freud would say that we lie to ourselves all the time, and then we have these defense mechanisms to kind of bury the truth in our subconscious, right? Even if are skeptical of a lot of Freud's ideas, which you should be, because I mean, his ideas are outdated and we're wrong in some ways. There's still something to that, right? That we all do that to ourselves. We have ways of, you find out that something that you believed is wrong, but your brain kind of kicks in and distorts it or makes you forget it or things like that. That's you lying to yourself, right? He also talks a little bit on the bottom of 244 onto the top of 245. It's kind of that last paragraph on 244 onto the top of 245, where he talks about the idea of the other. Now, this actually gets into some other more technical stuff that I don't want to go too far in, but it's kind of that idea of alienation, the other. But here he means this strictly about kind of other people, and sort of identifies the idea that bad faith often obtains when we lie to other people or are dishonest with other people, have interactions with others that are kind of dishonest. Right? Now, dishonest about what? I think what he's suggesting, and he gets into this in the next few examples, is that what we are lying to ourselves or others about is our being. And in particular, we kind of lie to ourselves or others about the fact that we have this being for itself that allows us to make free choices and allows us to be responsible for those. That any time you act as though you or another person is not a fully free or responsible human being, you are lying to yourself or that person and or that person. That when we do not fully accept and exercise our freedom and take full responsibility for our behavior, we are acting in bad faith. We are acting as though we are mere being in itself, like we are just like tables that are just things in the world that have no real choices. And we are not accepting the fact that we are being for itself too, that we have conscious free will that can transcend the determinism of our being in itself. So in order to kind of show this, he shows a few examples of this. And these are really kind of very telling examples, I think. on 246, he kicks in with that section, patterns of bad faith. And he basically just means, here are some examples that show this idea that bad faith obtains when people are not fully free or responsible, when they're not fully honest with themselves about their freedom and responsible, when they treat themselves or others as though they are mere being in itself instead of being for itself. And so the first one is this example of a date, a first date. And this is a great example here, right? So, and some of this is a little gendered, and we'll talk about that with de Beauvoir too here, but let's just sort of go that I think that his example could switch or change genders in any sort of way whatsoever would still be okay. But he has this very heteronormative idea of the first date of a man and woman, and in a very traditional kind of 50s sort of way of like the man has to ask out the woman and take the more active role and that kind of stuff. But just sort of bear with me as we go through that, right? So the whole thing is kind of in bad faith, right? So in particular, like notice here, like take this example of a woman who has consented to go out with a particular man for the first time. She knows very well the intentions which the man who is speaking to her cherishes regarding to her. And she knows also that it will be necessary sooner or later for her to make a decision. But she does not want to realize the urgency. So what's going on here? They both know what's really going on here. He wants to have sex with her. She doesn't know yet whether or not she wants to. She's still deciding. She knows that she'll have to make a choice at some point, yes or no, but she wants to put off the choice as long as possible. And so in order to do that, they both have to play this little game, right? You know what I'm talking about, all the little games that people play early in relationships, early on, first dates, things like that, where they're not honest. Think about what that would be like if the first date were completely honest. Hello, I would like to have sex with you. Thank you for saying that. I have not yet decided whether or not I want to have sex with you. Let us have a very long dinner and talk about other things instead. That would at least be a little bit more honest. What's the problem? It would be really weird, right? Like socially, for whatever reason, we don't do that. If somebody came up to you and said that the first time, like you'd be offended. You want to have sex with me? You just said that on the first date? That's really rude, creepy, and you'd probably walk out, right? But here's the thing, you totally know that's what's going on in their mind or they wouldn't have asked you out, right? So there's all sorts of falsehood here. The guy is not being totally honest. You can read all the details. It's rather amusing as you go along. But, he doesn't just say things like, I find you, like, I want to have sex with you. He just says like, oh, you look really nice tonight, or that's a lovely dress, or I like your hair that way, things like that. But always in the background, right, that she knows what he's really saying, but they're both pretending that he's not really saying it. There's even a part, this is getting on to kind of the top of 247. Yeah, good. I guess it's kind of right towards the bottom of 246 onto the top of 247, right? Yeah, so they're at the dinner table and they're having all this little chat here. And, she's refusing to acknowledge what he's really saying, but he's not really saying what he's really saying. And then I guess about, 6 lines down on 247. But then suppose he takes her hand, right? This act of her companion risks changing the situation by calling for an immediate decision, right? So he decides it's time to make his move, right? So now he's declaring his intentions at least a little bit more openly, a little more honestly, right? Physical contact, that sort of suggests something a little more. So now it seems like she's in a situation. She's got to make a decision. She either has to take her hand away, which is a no, full stop, or she has to take his hand back. So now they're holding hands, which is a yes, and we're moving forward with this. But she still doesn't want to make a decision, right? So what does she do? Neither. Secret option number C, a few lines down, right? The aim is to postpone the moment of a decision as long as possible. We know what happens next. The young woman leaves her hand there, but she does not notice that she's leaving it there. Okay? So she doesn't take his hand. She doesn't move it away. She pretends that she doesn't even notice that he's taken her hand. She leaves it there on the table like it's just an object, like it's just the salt shaker. And like he's just picking up the salt shaker. Again, notice what's going on here. She's treating herself as though she's just being in itself, like she's just another object in the room that just has to sort of stay there and doesn't make any decisions. That's bad faith on her part. She should treat herself as being for itself. Oh, that's not just the salt shaker, that's me that he's now touching. Now I have to make a decision. So she's being dishonest with herself and with him by doing that, right? But again, notice he's been very dishonest with her the time by not declaring his intentions, but it's this whole kind of first date game. Patterns of bad faith, he gives a couple of other examples. On 250, he talks about this idea of the waiter. It's about halfway down that beginning of that big paragraph there. Let us consider this waiter at the cafe. His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He comes towards the patrons with a step a little too quick. He bends forward a little too eagerly, his voice, his eyes express interest a little too solicitous for the order of the customer, etc., right? So what's going on here, right? So this is sort of interesting because maybe this is a bit of an influence of Marx. This kind of reminds me, and the next example he talks about does this too, that in these different economic or professional roles, we have a tendency to treat ourselves and others in bad faith. The waiter is pretending to care about the customers way more than he really does. Why? Well, if you've ever done service jobs, you know, because you want a tip, right? So, you know, the good waiters, it doesn't matter what mood you're really in, you act like you're in a great mood. It doesn't matter that these people are total strangers. You act like you really like them and like they're really neat. No matter how difficult they are, you act, oh, it's no trouble. I'm so happy to help, right? You treat yourself as though you are less and different than a full-fledged human being. You treat yourself like the waiter, right? You're being kind of dishonest with yourself and to them, right? But they know this too, and yet that's still what they want. So they're being dishonest with you, right? So when we treat people as though they're just these two-dimensional little professional roles, treat other people or ourselves, you know, employee, customer instead of human being, human being. There's a lot of bad faith involved there, and it kind of goes in both directions. We're lying to ourselves and lying to others, right? 251, he kind of generalizes that notion to all trades people, right? Especially kind of right at the right at the bottom of 250, about 5 lines. This obligation is not different from that which is imposed on all tradesmen. Their condition is wholly one of ceremony. The public demands of them that they realize it is a ceremony. There's the dance of the grocer, the tailor, the auctioneer, etc., etc. Right at the top of 251, I just skipped a sentence. A grocer who dreams is offensive to the buyer because such a grocer is not wholly a grocer. So, you know, what has he got in mind here? You're at the grocery store and you go to the checkout, right? And, you know, the checkout person, you know, makes a little small talk. You say, hi, did you find everything you were looking for? Does anybody ever say no to that? Probably some people, but I never do. Like, no, I'm missing this thing. Go find it for me. Like, I don't want to be held up. I don't want to hold up the people behind me, right? So I'm just like, yep, so I just lie, right? And they probably know that I'm lying. They probably know at least most of their customers are lying some of the time about that. And they want us to because they don't want me to hold them up either, right? They might also, while they're checking things out, talk about things, you know, like, oh, you know, how are you today? What am I going to say? I'm going to say fine, right? And I'm probably going to say back, oh, and how are you? Oh, I'm great today. What's the thing? Half the time we're probably both lying. Imagine I say to the grocery store, you know, checkout clerk, you know, oh, how are you today? And say, oh, I'm terrible. And they start talking about all their personal problems. That's really going to be annoying, right? I didn't really want to know. I'm sorry. I'm a terrible person. I'm living in bad faith. But I didn't want to know. I don't want them to be a human being. I just want them to be a grocer. The grocer who dreams is offensive to the buyer because they're not wholly a grocer. No, just play this little two-dimensional role, but then I'm treating them like less than a full human being. I'm treating them more like a thing, right? And they're doing that to me too, right? Like oh, we want the customer to come back and spend money. Right? So again, this reminds me a lot of Marx and that idea of alienation and how we're kind of alienated from ourselves and other people. And this is kind of the economic context. But Sartre is saying those too, but also more general sorts of things like romantic interactions. Right? And so notice this isn't, he's talked a lot about different social positions, work and things like that. But it's not just social positions, it's all sorts of attitudes and actions. On 251 to 252, the very last line of 251, right? Furthermore, we are dealing with more than just mere social positions. I'm never anymore any one of my attitudes, any one of my actions. The beginning of the next paragraph uses the example of being sad. So the thing is that I'm never more, I'm more than just any particular sort of attitude or action I'm performing at the moment. But I still have a bad faith way of treating myself as though I'm just that thing. So think about this idea of describing one's attitude or emotional state, saying I am sad. We have this tendency to kind of really throw ourselves into that attitude for long periods of time, as though that's really all we are, even though there's so much more that's going on at any given time. So this is why sometimes people who have suffered the loss of a loved one feel survivor's guilt to a certain extent, because they are sad, but also sometimes they're happy for a moment. They laugh at a joke on TV, and then they feel guilty for even feeling happy for a minute, right? Or they feel guilty about the fact that they just don't want to be sad anymore because being sad all the time is really awful, right? Another example, and this is more like kind of the example that he talks about, even kind of in the short term. So let's say I'm sad for even just a more ordinary reason. I broke something that I own that I really like, and oh, I'm sad and I can't afford a new one, just something trivial, right? So I'm walking around and I'm sad, and then I bump into somebody. And maybe it's somebody I know kind of well, but not really, really well, a coworker. And so it's not really appropriate for me to discuss my personal life with that person. I'm not comfortable doing that. So what happens? Well, while I'm talking to them, I just pretend I'm happy, right? And I'll have this kind of conversation with them and I'll chit chat and we'll joke around. But if you've probably experienced this before, especially if the conversation goes on for more than just a minute or two, what happens is that I kind of stop being sad. Like I actually am in a good mood now. I'm smiling and I'm joking around. But then when the conversation is over, it's almost like he says something like, it's almost like I've made a promise to myself to return to being sad again. Like, oh, whoops, I was supposed to be sad. I was really just kind of faking it before. And maybe for a minute I was, which was bad faith. But then after a while I wasn't. But then I went back to being sad again as though somehow I'm supposed to be sad instead of just choosing not to be sad anymore. And again, that's sort of bad faith. I'm lying to myself. I don't have to wholly be this particular attitude any more than I wholly have to be a waiter or a grocer or a philosophy professor or something like that, right? This always cracks me up because when he says the grocer that dreams is an offense to the buyer, I think a philosophy professor that dreams is offensive to the student. This happens sometimes when I run into students outside of the building. Like they're just shocked to see me sometimes. Like I go to the mall or something and I run into a student and they're like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, shopping. Is that okay? But they're just so weirded out. Like they can't imagine me. Like I think they think I live in my office at Fox or maybe they just shut me off at the end of the day or something like that. Like being a philosophy professor is lovely and it's a part of who I am. But I actually have a social life. Like I'm married and I have friends and I go out and about and do fun things and have hobbies, right? You don't have to be that freaked out. I sing karaoke once in a while. I ran into a student at karaoke and they were just horrified that I was singing karaoke. That's a thing that middle-aged people do. We Gen Xers love our karaoke, man. Go to the karaoke bar with the young people then if you don't like it, because you're going to see some of us out of there. Okay. So this is where he kind of wraps up by really talking about this idea of freedom and responsibility, right? So this kind of kicks in at the bottom of 253 and continues on there. And really, essentially, the claim that he wants to make is right at the bottom of 253. The essential consequence of our earlier remarks is that man, being condemned to be free, carries the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. He is responsible for the world and for himself as a way of being. So, I mean, lots of philosophers believe that free will exists, but they have some debates about how much you are free over. What do you have control over? So the Stoics thought, well, you've got control over your own actions and virtues, but you can't control an awful lot of like pretty much everything else. And that's why you shouldn't worry about those things, right? But Sartre is claiming there's kind of two things here. We're condemned to be free, he says. That's the only thing we're not really free to do is choose not to be free, because freedom is just part of the human condition. It's as close to human nature as he'd want to say there is. You are just sort of condemned, you're abandoned in the world, he says. He says that a little bit later. You just find yourself in this world with all this freedom and you can't do anything about that. But according to Sartre, that makes you not only free for yourself, but there is a sense in which you are responsible not just for your own behavior, but the entire world. And he goes on to say on 254, right towards the top there, right towards the bottom there, that last paragraph on 254, after talking about a couple of examples, he says there are no accidents in life. And he had talked about in the paragraph before this idea of war. So like he lived through World War II and the German occupation of France. And a lot of his fellow countrymen would say, you know, when the Germans rolled into town, like there are pictures of the French people like applauding the Nazis. Not because they were pro-Nazi, but because Nazis are really scary. And if you don't applaud them when they're rolling into town with tanks, they will kill you dead, right? And a lot of French people at the time were very critical of the French government for, on their view, kind of rolling over and just going along with the Nazis. And the people in those positions said, well, look, we had to do this, or they would have just killed everybody. We had no choice. And that's what Sartre is very critical of. Not necessarily their behavior. Maybe what they did was the smartest thing to do. But he was very critical of people saying we had no choice. According to Sartre, you absolutely had a choice. You could have fought. You could have run away. You could have joined the resistance. You could have rolled over and gone along with them. And in fact, that is the choice that you made, right? And maybe that was even the right choice. But don't say you didn't have a choice. You did have a choice. You made it. Now take responsibility for it. And when you do that, you are, in a sense, responsible for everything, including even the war and the occupation. You are responsible for it because you chose to go along with it rather than fight against it. And this is where he talks about, it seems like a kind of an extreme comment, but in the following paragraph, he talks about this idea of suicide. And to be clear, he is not making light of the idea, and he's certainly not encouraging it. But he simply wants to point out that there is a sense in which you are responsible for the entire world because nobody can force you to live in it. If you really think that the world is so bad that you don't want to accept it, there's always the option of suicide. Now, again, I'm not saying that he is claiming this is a good option or the right option, but he's saying don't pretend it's not an option. I don't think he would advocate people committing suicide. I think he would advocate them trying to make the best of things and doing as much as they can to change the world. But you still have to admit that simply by deciding actively to continue to live your life in this world, you share in the responsibility for that. So it seems like a kind of a radical thing to say, but we are responsible for everything except our own responsibility. Like we can't be responsible. We can't be sort of free to choose not to be free and responsible. Freedom is something that is unfortunately forced on you by your existence, and therefore you're forced to take that responsibility. And he says, even the fact of your birth, this is on 256 there. Where is this, right? Yeah, the first full paragraph. Yet this responsibility is of a very particular type. Someone will say, I did not ask to be born, right? And so this is a naive way of throwing greater emphasis on our facticity, our being in itself, right? So, and again, you can kind of read the details. I'm summarizing here a little bit. But the idea, he says in that paragraph, is yeah, there's a sense in which you're not responsible for your mere facticity, the fact that you exist as being in itself, this physical thing in the world, right? But you still take responsibility for the fact of your birth in the sense that you choose how to view that event. You choose how to view your existence in this world and what to do with it. You're responsible for your own responsibility, at least in the sense that you get to choose how to behave and how therefore to be free and responsible. It is true, he will say, we are abandoned in the world. We didn't choose to be free and responsible things, but then we choose what to do with it, including how to even think of your own birth as a good thing or a bad thing or something to do something with rather than sit around and complain about. So in that more general sense, yeah, you are. So he wraps up here a little bit on 257, on the 258, this idea of the desire to be God. And this, it's just a few pages, it does get pretty technical there. So let me just kind of summarize that for you. This goes back to his idea of God, that the traditional Western definition of God, he would say, is a perfect being, which again, as I said before, means perfect being in itself and perfect being for itself. Perfect facticity, perfect transcendence, fully perfectly actualized, but also still having full perfect potential. And that is a contradiction. You can't be fully actual and still have full potential. Those are inverse things. The more actualized you are, the more potentiality you've given up to get there. The more potential you have, the less actualization you have, because potential means actualizing, right? But that's this constant struggle. We want to be like the so-called notion of God, where we're fully actual and fully potential. But we can't do that. You cannot fully actualize without giving up potential, and that's impossible. And so that's this constant tension in our existence. There's this kind of weird ambiguity in our existence because of that. In our next reading, Simone de Beauvoir is going to pick up on that. And it's this weird sort of fact. It's this kind of odd observation. He says, man is a useless passion because freedom does involve this kind of self-annihilation, that freedom means not fully existing yet in order to have choices, or choosing to become things and then sort of annihilating, giving up what you were before in terms of your potential. And it reminds me of that Nietzsche, that all creation involves destruction, and therefore all choice also involves giving up choice. The exercise of freedom is now giving up some freedom. But then as human beings, we can never do that fully. We're kind of constantly caught in that battle. And that's all we have to guide us, is this kind of complete freedom and responsibility without really anything else to tell us what to do with it. And that makes us a useless passion, he says. And de Beauvoir will pick up on that idea to give us some sense of, okay, I'm totally free and totally responsible. Now what? Because so far, Sartre doesn't seem to have answered that question. Okay, interesting stuff. Neat examples in there too. I love the first date example. That one always cracks me up every time I read it. Let me know if you have questions. I'll post some discussions. And the usual. Thanks.